Hi, this is Patrick from LSAT Lab. We're here to talk about parallel reasoning questions in the logical reasoning section. Now, these are only 3% of questions. You're going to get 1 or 2 on every test, but they do stick out in our minds because they're among the longest questions. The answer choices themselves are arguments, so these sort of flow off the screen. You're normally going to have to scroll a little bit to read all of the answers. What we want to talk about today is how do we spot that we're doing one? What should we be doing to read and think about it correctly? And as we talk about that, we'll be thinking about ways to describe the structure of the argument, the ingredients of the argument, and the validity of the argument so that we can match each of those up. And of course, we want to be aware of what types of trap answers we're likely to see. Here's what the question stem looks like for a parallel reasoning question. The pattern of reasoning is referring, to this deeper archetype that we're going to be searching for, the recipe of how we got there. And then the most frequent keyword for parallel questions is saying which argument below is most similar to the one above. In this case, we're still talking about a pattern of reasoning. Instead of saying most similar, we're saying which of the following answers most closely parallels, most conforms to the same pattern of reasoning. Or here we've got the reasoning above most closely resembles which answer choice. Here's a more obscure one that uses the term principle. It's asking us which answer choice is using an implied principle that matches the implied illustrated principle above. When we say that a principle is illustrated, we mean it's not explicitly cited, it is just evident in the reasoning that gets used. When we're doing parallel reasoning or parallel flaw, we're going to need to read the argument to find the conclusion, find all the supporting ideas, and then evaluate essentially how did the author combine his premises to derive his conclusion. One of the things we're going to start trying to do is speak a vocabulary of what types of claims were used. Were they conditional? Were they either or? Were they normative, like should or ought? Were they comparative, like greater, lesser? Was there a causal claim? Was there just a statement of fact? And another thing that we're going to be thinking about is how strongly worded were these claims? Are they the strength of probable? Words like most, likely, usually, generally. Or do they just speak of possibility? Do they say can, may, might? By thinking about the types of claims and the strength of claims, you have an easier time naming mismatches when you get to the answers. When we get to the stage of anticipating, before we head into the answers, a lot of what we'll be asking ourselves is, what's going to be the easiest thing for me to look for first? Either to find a quick mismatch or to get my bearings on this argument so that I can then match up the corresponding parts. And then, of course, when we look at the answers, we're going to try to be a little bit aggressive here and scan looking for certain things so that we don't have to drain so much time and energy by reading all 5 answers from start to finish. Since our job on parallel reasoning is to figure out the recipe of the author's logic, a lot of these arguments lend themselves to being converted into something that kind of resembles algebra. So conditional logic is hugely prevalent. You will sometimes see a minority of arguments that feel more like a conversational understanding would be easier. But if you see anything involving conditional words or quantity words, it's usually a pretty good idea to actually diagram the recipe of the argument. But some of the time, I know it's not like that. Times where it's more just like a rule of thumb, where you see it as, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If it was true yesterday, it'll be true tomorrow. Things like that we might not need to diagram. We can just think about the underlying principle. Go ahead and pause the recording, try this question, and when you're done, unpause and we'll talk about it. Let's role play how we would break down this argument. We're expecting conditional logic most of the time, and we see it right out of the gate with the word if. We know anytime we see if, the idea that's going with it is a sufficient condition. It goes on the left-hand side. So we would want to write a rule that says, if the ground is wet, then it won't be solid. The second sentence also begins with if. We're getting another conditional rule. If it's not solid, okay, so they're continuing from where our last rule left off, we could continue to chain it onto the existing conditional, or we could show ourselves what this second idea looks like by just writing it on its own. If the concrete isn't solid, it settles unevenly or it cracks. Ors and ands are very important in conditional logic, so when we see one, we make sure that in our representation of that rule, it clearly matches the or the and. Because when we write a contrapositive, we need to flip that or and the and. So we want to make sure we're getting it right going in so that our contrapositive will also look correct. So here we have, if it's not solid, it won't be even, or it will crack. And on LSAT, we know that or means at least one of those things would be true. It might settle unevenly and also crack. Our last sentence begins with the word so, which always indicates a conclusion. And in this case, it indicates the only conclusion, the main conclusion. It is yet again conditional because we have another if. So our conditional says if it settles evenly, then either the ground wasn't wet or it will crack. I could write the word dry, but I'm trying to keep track of logical opposites. The idea is that we're symbol matching, A, not A. So when we see that dry is the logical opposite of wet, rather than introducing a new variable, we want to record that as the opposite of wet. This is valid logic, since wet ground forces us to think it'll either be uneven or cracked. If it's even, then the only two ways you could get there is that it wasn't wet to begin with, or it was wet, but you went with the crack option instead of the not even option. So it's a little bit complicated. We have two conditional premises that give us a chain from A to B to C, but really the last part of the chain is an either or. So if you're putting this into algebra, you'd think, I got if A then B, I've got if B then C or D, and then my conclusion is saying, if not C, then either not A or D. Let's start looking at the answers and try to match it up. What I would be doing prior to seeing my first answer is going, okay, what's going to be the easiest way for me to tell that an answer choice is wrong? Conclusion mismatches are often a frequent way to tell an answer doesn't have a chance. So if I can see the conclusion very easily in the answer, I just want to make sure that it is a conditional with an or in the second half, in the outcome of the conditional. The other thing I'll be scanning for is I need two conditional premises and they need to chain together. So I need to have one that says A to B and another one that says B to C or D. When we look at A, if we glance at the conclusion prefaced by the word so, we do have a conditional with an either or in the outcome, so this one's worth reading. We have two conditional premises. Each time the word if is the trigger. It doesn't matter where the word if appears in the sentence, it's still a sufficient condition. So we will say, if not working, then not properly exposed. Our other premise is also a conditional, and it looks like it is correctly moving that chain along. It starts from the idea of, and if you're not exposed, then you end up blurred or dark. So we know that at this point we should be expecting a conclusion that says, if you're not blurred, then either you're working or you're dark. Or a conclusion that says, so if you're not dark, then you're either working or you're blurred. Once I have one or more matching ingredients, I often will be thinking to myself, what should the conclusion sound like before I even get there? This is a good way to make sure that we're clear on the logic we're looking for. If we know what we're doing, we should already know what the conclusion is supposed to sound like. And so then if it deviates from that, we'll be able to tell even more quickly. As soon as you have some matching ingredients, you should try to figure out what the correct matching conclusion would sound like. This one looks good. So if it's not blurred, then either we didn't launch this chain, it was working properly, or we launched this whole chain and we're going with that second option of being dark. Since A matches, we could potentially gamble and pick this. Since it is very time consuming to read all the answer choices on parallel, this is the sort of question where if an answer early on works, you might want to pick it, flag it, and move on. And then if you have time, you'll come back and revisit the other answer choices. The more confident we are about the logic we derived from the original, the more confident we'll be about a correct answer matching that logic. And it will give us the confidence that would make us feel okay simply saying, okay, I'm convinced this matches. Let's move on. Let's look at the other answers though and figure out why they are deviating from this recipe. Once again, if I glance at the conclusion, I want to see a conditional with an or in the outcome. And here the conclusion has an and in the outcome. So I would get rid of it from there. I would keep on moving. For practice, we can look at what it actually says. We have a conditional. If it's working, then it's not blurred. So my next premise better be a conditional that says, if it's not blurred. Instead, my next conditional actually has a complex or trigger and then ends with, it is blurred. Well, I could actually contrapose that. I could make this work to be a little bit closer. That second conditional would say, if it isn't blurred, then it's both exposed and properly developed. But even being that charitable, I'm not liking this as a match because that would make the contrapositive something that has an and in the outcome. In the original argument, the second conditional had an or in the outcome. So the second premise is giving us a reason we could bail at this point. If we did make it all the way to the conclusion, again telegraphed by the word so, we would at this point notice that our conclusion is offering us a conditional with an and in the outcome, whereas the original argument had an or in the outcome. If that feels nitpicky, that's what parallel reasoning can be all about. We want to be nitpicky, so we're really sweating the details. These details are annoying to deal with, but they actually make it much easier to explain to your brain why this answer is wrong. So this had a wrong conclusion, wrong premise, and a mismatching structure because of the fact that it was going to end up deriving something with an and. Here, when I look at my conclusion, I see that it is a conditional, but there's no and or. So I would get rid of C just based on that conclusion mismatch. For practice, if we look at what is there, we do have one conditional that if it's not working, it's blurred or dark. That's could theoretically be our second premise from the original. It doesn't matter what order they present the ingredients, as long as we get both of those conditionals. So I'm not going to hold it against C that it started with a conditional that has or in the outcome. What I'm going to need now is that other conditional that should say, if something, then not working. It needs to end with not working. But when we look at the second premise, it's actually just a statement of fact. When we write those in our diagrams, we just sort of write the idea. And by not putting an arrow, we're sort of sending the message to our brain, oh yeah, and then at this point, they just literally told me that something was not blurred. The conclusion, as we mentioned, will not match because there's no or in the outcome. This is valid logic. If it weren't working, it would either be blurred or dark. So if it's not blurred and it's not dark, it is working. So congratulations, C. You do have valid reasoning on your side. But you do not have a structural mismatch. You only gave us one conditional premise, and your conclusion doesn't have an or in the outcome. When we look at the conclusion of D, again, there's no or in the outcome. Get rid of D. If the conclusion doesn't match, not worth reading. For practice, that first conditional says if it's working properly, it's exposed. We really want the next conditional to say if it's exposed, then this thing or that thing. Instead, we get exposed as part of an or trigger. Not going to do it. That would be another reason to get rid of this. Let's look at the conclusion for practice just to think, is this valid logic? This is valid logic. Working gets me to exposed, and exposed or developed is enough to trigger not dark. So working takes me all the way to not dark. Good job, D. Your logic is valid. You just don't match our structure. If we go straight to the conclusion, it looks like there's a conditional, but the or is in the trigger. If we contrapose that, it's going to put an and in the outcome. So this conclusion does not match, and so there's no real reason to read E either. If we do want to set up E for practice, only if is different from if. If always indicates a sufficient left side idea. Only if will always indicate a necessary right side of the arrow idea. So we know properly exposed has to go on the right side of the arrow. Our conditional will look like if it's working properly, then it's been properly exposed. That means our next conditional needs to start with if it's exposed, then this thing or that thing. We could contrapose this and get if it's exposed, then there is enough light and there's not too much light. Which is to say, we're in the sweet spot. But we wouldn't want a conditional that has an and in the outcome that wouldn't match the original. And again, when we look at the conclusion, were we to diagram that, we would see that there was an or in the trigger or an and in the outcome. However you slice it, it's not going to match the original. Was this valid logic? Sure, this is valid logic. If we look at the second conditional, it says if there's not enough or there's too much, then it won't be exposed properly. And the contrapositive of the first rule is saying if it's not exposed properly, then it won't work. So we could chain those two conditional premises together to derive what the conclusion is giving us. Once again, valid logic, but not a match to the recipe that we started off with. Back to our correct answer A. We looked at the conclusion and we saw it did have a conditional with the or in the outcome. And I think it was the only one that did. So that conclusion shortcut can be very useful. It's usually not this useful, but it typically can get rid of one or two answers without us having to read them. It's normally only going to be an effective shortcut when it's easy to describe the type of claim that the conclusion is with some sort of interesting vocabulary. If a conclusion said, so therefore the rain got me wet, there's really no features there to call out. It's just a statement of fact. But this conclusion is a conditional with an or in the outcome. Or if you contrapose it, it would be a conditional with an and in the trigger. That sort of nerdy vocabulary is super useful because looking for that in all 5 of these answer choices would get us right away to choice A. All right, so we looked at an example that heavily rewards sort of diagramming, algebra, conditional logic, that sort of like mathematical thinking. Let's look at one that's more in the comparative zone that has more of a conversational understanding to it. Pause the video, give this one a try on your own, and then unpause when you're ready to hear it discussed. Welcome back. The question stem says, which argument's most similar to the argument above? So we know we're doing parallel reasoning. It didn't say what's most similar to the flawed reasoning above. So we don't think we're looking for a flaw. We think we're looking at a reasonable, if not airtight argument. Notice that in this argument, there is no conditional logic. It's actually more of a rebuttal style argument. If you watched music videos in the 70s, you would see a lot of synth pop and punk rock. But don't get it twisted. Don't think that that was dominating the airwaves at the time. It's just that music videos were like a new art form, and so it was the cutting edge musicians that were gravitating towards them initially. We're apparently assuming that cutting edge musicians were more often found in the synth pop and punk rock worlds than in other styles. Is this an airtight argument? Definitely not. But we're not here to judge its flaws. We're here to think about why it's reasonable, how the author got to her conclusion. She's actually doing something we would applaud. We know that one of the classic flaws in LSAT is to go off of a potentially misleading sample. Our author is saying the sample of musicians that you got in music videos are not representative of musicians in general in the 70s. It was skewed towards the avant-garde cutting edge. Unlike the last argument, this argument doesn't really advertise any conditional logic. It starts off with a point of view that will turn out to be a counterpoint, because it'll be followed by the word but. Our author is saying, that first idea I gave you is misleading. So what was the idea? It was that if you watched music videos from the 70s, you would start thinking that, oh, I guess 70s music was dominated by synth pop and punk rock. Our author is concluding, no, don't get it twisted. Music videos were a new art form, so the types of musicians doing music videos were actually like a specifically weird subset, cutting-edge musicians, not a representative sample. Our author is definitely assuming that synth pop and punk rock musicians were more likely to be cutting-edge musicians. So this is not an airtight argument, but it's a very reasonable one. We know that one of the famous flaws in LSAT is to rely on an unrepresentative sample. And that's exactly what our author is warning us against. She's saying you shouldn't look at music videos and think that what you see there is representative of music in the 70s. In the 70s, let's say half of it was country, half of it was punk. But if it's only punk rockers making the music videos, you're going to get the wrong impression. So when we go to these answer choices, we don't really have an easy structural thing to look out for like last time. We don't really have the whole idea of, okay, it's got to be a conditional conclusion with an or in the outcome. But we can still think about the type of claim the conclusion is and the strength of claim. Our conclusion is a sort of rebuttal idea. This would be misleading. This could give off the wrong idea. If we look at the conclusion in A, it says that our view of literature can never be accurate. Because indicates a premise, the other half of any sentence with the word because in it has to be a conclusion. So we know that first half is being supported by the second half. So is that a good match for strength of language? If I say this would be a misleading impression, is that the same as saying this could never be accurate? A feels way stronger. So I would already distance myself from that just based on the conclusion. If we dug in deeper later, does it actually involve a warning against an unrepresentative sample? It does. The premise is saying the sample of works that survive are atypical in that they were the ones that copyists thought would be most interesting to future readers. So we might not realize how much mediocre crap there was because the only stuff that they decided to actually copy was the really good stuff. So it does have sort of a warning against sampling, but the conclusion is way stronger than the conclusion of the original. Moving on to B. Again, the word because shows us that the second half of this sentence is a premise, which means that first half was our conclusion. The conclusion here is saying our memory of 60s shows could hardly be improved. Well, that doesn't sound anything like this would be misleading. It actually sounds like the opposite. It's saying we have sort of the perfect understanding of 1960s TV shows because they're still rerunning them today. So this really doesn't have the right conclusion, the right logic. This is off on several levels. When we look at C, the word since is showing us that the second claim is a premise. So the first one was our conclusion. The conclusion is saying that our understanding will be distorted. That's pretty close to we would have a misleading impression. A distorted understanding, a misleading impression. I'm liking that. Is there a warning here about an atypical sample? Yes, it's telling us that if we looked at CD-ROM and we were trying to extrapolate what that meant for publishing trends of the day, we would get a skewed idea because there was sort of a atypical sample of people involved in CD-ROM. It was the publishers that were interested in computer games. So let's keep this. This looks pretty strong. And in fact, it does end up being our correct answer. When we look at D, the word because indicates the second claim is a premise, so that first claim is our conclusion. Our understanding is incomplete. How does that compare to we would get a misleading impression? An incomplete understanding and a misleading impression. Not as good as C, but maybe I'll consider it. Does our premise warn us against an atypical sample? It does not. It's saying our understanding of silent films might be mistaken, but it's not because the people who made silent films were from a specific subset of cutting-edge filmmakers. It's just saying a bunch of the filmmakers didn't realize that the film would disintegrate over time. This isn't showing us that the people who made silent films were an atypical subset of filmmakers. It's just saying most filmmakers of that time didn't realize how much the film would deteriorate. So I guess they didn't take precautions, and most of the silent films that were made have probably deteriorated. So that's why we have an incomplete understanding. But it's not because of an atypical sample. It's just because most of the original things are destroyed. That premise is a bad match. We need to be warning us against an atypical sample. When we look at choice E, there's an opinion indicator in the first sentence, which makes us inclined to think that first claim is our conclusion. This says our notion will probably be accurate. That feels like the opposite of misleading impression. An accurate notion would be the opposite of a misleading impression. So this conclusion is garbage. I would be done. This actually doesn't even have a premise. It has sort of a counterpoint. It's more set up as a paradox. So this also doesn't have an argument structure. It does have an idea that matches the premise because it is saying there is an atypical sample happening. The outfits that you see on these TV shows are unrepresentative of outfits in general because they're specifically selected to be outrageous in order to garner attention. But our conclusion then is getting it completely wrong and saying, so you can trust fashion trends based on these programs. So C is our correct answer. Once again, the big trap answer categories on parallel reasoning will be that the premise doesn't match, either in terms of type or strength. In our first example, we needed 2 conditional premises. Some of the answers only had 1 conditional premise. We also needed one of those premises to have an or in the outcome, and some of them had an and in the outcome. Wrong conclusion is usually the easiest mismatch we can find, but it's easier to spot when the conclusion has a signature strength or signature feel. So try to describe the conclusion to yourself in wording like, I need a conditional with an or in the outcome. Or, I need something like a moderately strong rebuttal, a misleading impression, but nothing like, it could never be accurate. So that middle strength between certainty and possibility. We're also going to see on parallel reasoning where the original argument is valid, we might see an answer choice that's flawed. That's enough of a mismatch to know get rid of it. The sneakiest type of mismatch is where it's also a valid argument, and the premise and conclusion pretty much match up in terms of types of claims, strength of claims, but there's just some nitpicky difference like or versus and that would make one answer more similar to the original than another. So how do we spot parallel questions? They're asking us which argument in the answer choices is most similar or parallel or resembles most the argument that you're seeing in the stimulus. Most of these will have conditional logic. That's what makes them conducive to diagramming or to sort of converting into algebra. But when they don't, we don't need to force that. If it's possible for us to think about the type of argument without going to that mode, for instance, by saying, we want an author that's rebutting a claim by saying that it's based on an unrepresentative sample. That can be just as effective or more effective if you're reading an argument that doesn't have conditional logic. So as you practice these, pay attention when you're first reading it to whether the argument seems to be in a very logic math style, where it would behoove us to try to diagram it with, all A's are B. Or if it doesn't seem to have a mathematical conditional logic style, then try to just understand it conversationally. When we get to the answer choices, be very aggressive about getting rid of something based on the first mismatch you see. You can always come back to that answer if you didn't find any other answer you liked, but we need to experiment with being very picky so that we can get through these more efficiently. So if you look straight at the conclusion and it doesn't seem to match the type of claim or strength of claim, bail. Do not read that answer. If you're looking for 2 conditional premises that chain together and there's only one premise, or there's only one conditional premise, or there's two conditionals but they don't chain together. Any of those mismatches would be enough to say goodbye answer choice. Thanks for watching this video. Please check out some of our other videos or come see us at lsatlab.com.